Good afternoon. Cheryl and Cindy have asked me to talk about riparian systems and who benefits from early xeral forest conditions and what are some of the opportunities and challenges in managing riparian areas. I guess very simply, to answer this question about riparian systems, who benefits from early xeral forest condition, I would like to stress that it's important to answer this question from the point of the stream network, of the river network. If you look at it just as a local site, you might inadvertently take some actions that aren't really beneficial to the stream ecosystem. The early on, stream ecologists back around the mid-1970s recognized that water runs downhill. It takes us a little while, but we get it eventually. And so streams and rivers are these thin ribbons that dissect the landscape, and they're connected from their headwaters to their mouths. And so when we start talking about forest conditions in riparian areas, really what we are influencing is this interface, this ecotone between the stream ecosystem and the terrestrial ecosystem. And so it's important what occurs along that entire river network. And the consequences of our landscape and land cover are going to be manifest at the river network, not just a local site. And I will stress, I mentioned to Cheryl early on when I was given this question, I'm a bit of a skeptic about early xeral stages in riparian areas, and I'll tell you why at the end. It'll come back around. But they do have an important role in river networks and an important role in forest landscapes. I'll work up from the microbes to the fish to some of the general riparian forest conditions. First of all, just a little bit of information on nitrogen dynamics. In the Links 2 studies, Sherry Johnson and Linda Ashkenas and Dan Sabota and myself looked at small streams, some here on OSU's campus, Oak Creek, right out here in the Ag Reach, and down in the urban reach and up in McDonald Down Forest. But we also looked at two other sets of forest, ag, and urban streams. And I realized that early xeral forests aren't necessarily the equivalent of agricultural or urban, but we were looking at forested sites and then agricultural sites and urban sites. And one of the things we noticed in the characteristics of nitrogen uptake is that within our 200 to 300 meter long stream reaches, the stream retained about 10 to 60% of the nitrate that we added. If we got to agricultural streams, that went up to about 10 to 65%. And then in the open urban reaches, it was anywhere from 40 to 99% of the nitrogen that we added was retained within only 200 to 300 meters. And so why would an urban stream retain more nitrogen than a forest stream? And purely and simply, it was because some of the urban streams, like Periwinkle Creek in Albany or Amazon Creek in Eugene, were thick mats of filamentous algae sucking up nitrate as fast as it could. And so where we have more open conditions and more sunlight reaching the stream, there is the potential for higher rates of primary production in the stream ecosystem itself and for nutrient uptake. But that material also breaks down quickly and is released again. It's not like it's permanently stored. We also have looked, and I know you can't tell what all these things are, but these are the emergence and the densities of aquatic insects in early xeral stages and in mature forest conditions in the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. This is the work of Charles Frady. And what you see in each of these comparisons are three sets of paired sites. There we go. This is so weak you probably can't see it. So you see the three sets, left, middle, and right, and those are paired early xeral and late successional forest sites, and three pairs of each in summer, autumn, winter, and spring. And basically, Charles found in his research that there was no difference in the density of macroinvertebrates in the stream, no difference in the emergence of aquatic insects between the early xeral stage forest and the late successional stage forest. That indicates that there was no negative effect of shifting from a late successional forest in terms of the macroinvertebrate densities and emergence. But at the same time, it shows that there is no greater production of macroinvertebrates in those early seral stage riparian forests either. This is a potentially important food resource, not just for trout and salmon in the stream, but also for the wildlife in the forests around it. Studies of bird communities in the Coast Range, also studies over in Japan and Hokkaido, have found that approximately a third of the food for the forest birds is coming out of the streams as aquatic insects. So this is an important subsidy for the terrestrial ecosystem as well. Any of you that have walked along a stream in the morning and have seen the dew on the spider webs along the stream, have just seen this highway of spider webs. The reason they're there is it's a predictable supply of aquatic insects coming out of the stream ecosystem, and it's an important food resource for the terrestrial ecosystem. There was also a study by Banks in the Coast Range looking at harvested streams in intermittent and perennial. And in these particular studies in the Coast Range, she did find that the clear-cut sites had significantly greater production of insects than the forested sites for mayflies, stoneflies, caddisflies, and then the true flies. And so you see the decrease here in the shaded and open, that's the forested sites, and then the hatched and the dark ones are the clear-cut sites. And so in this particular example, there was greater production of invertebrates in the clear-cut sites than in the forest sites. The riparian areas are also important in terms of plant diversity. Years ago with Art McKee and Steve Acker and others, we found that the highest diversity in streams in the Cascades, that's this solid line here, the hump out in the middle, the highest diversity of riparian, of total plants, terrestrial plants, woody tree species, occurred in the floodplain. Higher diversity of terrestrial plants in the floodplain than in the upslope forest. The other important aspect of this is in drier sites like the Sierra Nevada that you see in the dashed line, the increase in diversity occurs closer and closer to the wetted channel. So the drier the site, the more we see that diversity expressed near the channel. And again, early seral stage forests have unique plant communities, and we would expect this diversity pattern to be exhibited adjacent to streams. So the riparian areas are real hotspots for plant diversity, terrestrial plant diversity in the landscape. So that's just helping you see the two. I should have done that before so you can see it. So this one is the Cascades, and this one is this, and then this one's the Sierra Nevada. Now, another important part of forests along streams that has become important in recent years is the contribution of large wood. You were probably expecting this one. Large wood is critical in many ways in streams. I won't go into all the many ways. You've already heard it. As we have early seral stages along our riparian areas, we're also influencing the dynamics of wood. We've done several studies throughout the Northwest and all show similar results of the proportion of the input of wood into the stream that comes as a function of distance away out to one site potential tree height. And as we go from an old-growth forest to a clear-cut stream, we see a decrease in the amount of wood entering the stream, and it comes from closer to the stream than in the older forest. So if we shift to early seral stage forest, we're influencing the input of large wood. This was observed in the Coast Range and reported in Stednick's, the book that Stednick edited on hydrological and biological responses of forest practices. And in terms of the large wood volume or number, old growth reaches had much more wood than second growth reaches, and those that were open and had no forest cover had almost no wood in those streams in the Coast Range. This is from Kurt Veldhuizen's thesis research. And then also in terms of he identified the type of wood, and compared alder versus coniferous versus stand age. And so we see with coniferous wood in the stream that in young stands you have very small amounts of coniferous wood in the stream. And that increases with increasing stand age. But you don't really get to substantial standing stocks of large coniferous wood until you're in excess of 100 years. So by areas of early seral forest along the streams will have lower amounts of coniferous wood in the stream. There will be, in this early seral stage, between 40 to 80 years, increased amounts of alder as the alder growing along the stream starts to die and enter the stream. And so you can have an input of alder, and a substantial input of alder, but that decreases after about 80 years. And there's a big difference between the characteristics of alder and coniferous wood. And there's also a big difference between aquatic and terrestrial. Mark Harmon and myself and Randy Wildman and several others did an experiment that's ongoing. You've all heard of the log decomp study up in the Andrews. What you may not be aware of is that there is a wet version of that as well in the streams up in the Andrews, where we're tracking the same 3 species in the stream to see how they decompose. So the idea was terrestrial, we will see relatively fast decomposition and colonization. Most of that decomposition will be biological, and it will be deep because the insects will burrow into the wood, forming galleries, and allow decomposition to occur deep inside the wood. On the stream, on the other hand, you know why people dump logs into log ponds, to keep them from decomposing and drying out and checking. And so if a piece of wood is waterlogged, there's no oxygen down in there, so the decomposition rates are greatly reduced. And so we predicted that in the stream we would see slower decay. It would be primarily physical breakdown from mechanical breakdown on the surface, and it would be at the surface. So we put in logs, these same logs, down into Lookout Creek in the Andrews, and then Mark had his terrestrial placement up on the forest floor along Lookout Creek. And so here's some examples of the decomposition, some cross-sections through the wood. And so here's alder from year 2 to year 6 to year 14 in the stream versus terrestrial. And you don't see a whole lot of difference between stream and terrestrial. It gets pretty punky inside the log fairly quickly in the aquatic, and it decays fairly rapidly. Douglas fir, on the other hand, there was a substantial difference between the aquatic and terrestrial. Terrestrial, by the year 14, we were already seeing this decomposition as the outer portion of the log had galleries formed inside it and was decomposing, but we didn't see that in the 14-year-old logs in the stream. And so when we compared decomposition rates, alder had the blue line had a substantially faster decomposition than the terrestrial. And so really by the end of only 15 years, we were down to only about 40% of the alder logs remaining. So even though early seral stages may introduce alder wood, and it may be slightly richer in nitrogen, it decomposes faster, and so it doesn't play a major role structurally in the stream for as long. We've also looked at fish up in these same streams and found that the forest conditions do matter to the fish populations. Here's the pattern of cutthroat trout abundance in the dark line is the clear cut in Mack Creek, and the light green line is the old growth in Mack Creek through time. And right after we started looking at this stream about 9 years after it had been the riparian area and upslope had been harvested in a small patch cut, and the fish numbers were almost double. Through time, that has diminished, and so the difference between, as the riparian area reestablishes, we're seeing less and less difference between the cutthroat. So you can get increased fish abundance in some open areas because of increased primary production, increased algae, increased insect food supply, and you can get greater numbers of fish. We did find that we get a high amount of interannual variation in the trout populations. Anadromous populations on the coast have a year-to-year variation of about 60%. The resident populations, it's about 26%. And this was published in the Stednick book on the Coast Range. One of the things we noticed was the interannual variation in trout populations increased in Needle Branch. In Flynn Creek, the control site, there was very little difference in terms of interannual variation both before logging and after logging. But in Needle Branch, the clear-cut site, before logging, the interannual variation was about the same as we saw in Flynn Creek. But after logging, it was 3 times greater and continues to be to this day, about 2 to 3 times greater. So the populations fluctuate more. The other important aspect of this large wood component is the role of floods and disturbances. Disturbances can be quite good in streams. This is a stream's way of cleaning itself up and restoring itself and creating floodplains. But these floods, also these flood peaks, can cause decreases in certain circumstances. In Mack Creek, we found the highest densities of fish after the 1996 flood. It created spawning gravels. It was in the forest. In the forested reach, we saw the least decrease. We had no change in adult fish, and we had 4 times as many fry the year after the flood as we had the year before the flood. And so the floods can actually be beneficial, but it does require refuge from the flood for them to be able to persist. And so in simplified areas, we found that they decreased. In areas that had complex habitat, they increased after the flood. And in general, we found an increase in the abundance of fish with increased discharges, but the clear cuts, again, were more variable. In the Coast Range, one of the first paired watershed studies, obviously, was the Alsea watershed study that was reported recently in this synthesis that John Stednick edited. And you've all probably seen Flynn Creek, the control site, Deer Creek, the patch cut site, and Needle Branch, the clear cut site. And people quickly say, oh, wait a minute, we don't do things that way anymore, so these results don't really apply. But at the same time, there are many open reaches along streams, and we'll come back to talking about the fact that there are many open sites along streams and early seral stages. So how did coho salmon respond and cutthroat trout respond in these streams and the sea run cutthroats that had come back up? This is a very busy picture, but basically it says for coho salmon, in terms of the abundance, the biomass out here, there was actually more biomass of coho after clear cutting, even continued out to the period of the early 1990s. In Needle Branch, in Flynn Creek, the control site, there was little change. If anything, it went down, and little change in Deer Creek. Cutthroat trout, and the coefficient of variation, though, was about the same in Flynn Creek before and then the late period after logging. But we did find the coho numbers became much more variable, almost double the coefficient of variation in coho in Needle Branch. Cutthroat trout continue to this day to be less abundant in Needle Branch than they were before logging. And the coefficient of variation now is about 3 to 4 times what it was before. So a much more variable cutthroat trout population. And you can see this in this comparison here of before, immediately after, and long after in the control site, and before, immediately after, and long after in Needle Branch. Now, a lot of people in managing riparian areas have said, well, wait a minute, why shouldn't, if silvicultural techniques can increase some of the plant community characteristics that would be beneficial, why can't we go into these areas and do things like thinning or prescribe fire? And my quick answer is there is no reason why you shouldn't be able to do it as long as there's a good ecological basis for going into the site, and you know that as a result of your practice, you can leave it in the condition that you desire. The question is, how much of the landscape do we want in those conditions, and why? Norm Johnson and Jerry Franklin and several of us tried to do some analysis down on the Coquille River system for the Coquille Indian tribe to come up with some management for some land that they were hoping to obtain and manage. And we recommended intensive thinning because the forests were largely young Douglas fir, dominated by Douglas fir overstory and sword fern underneath, and not much diversity at all. And in that case, the thinning could have potentially beneficial effects as long as you minimize the structural damage along the stream. Many people have suggested prescribed fire. There was a recent paper by Arkell and Piliad that may have already been discussed today, in which they compared the percent riparian burned versus the percent of the catchment burned, comparing wildfire, which is the open circles, versus prescribed fire. And so we see that in the prescribed fire, a smaller proportion of the riparian area is actually being burned. It's really not emulating wildfire. The same thing in terms of, you looked at the severity of the burn, the proportion, as you increase the proportion of the catchment burned up to about 30%, you got up to about 9 to 12% of the area being severely burned. But in the riparian areas, none of it was essentially severely burned. So suggesting that the prescribed fire is, again, somewhat different than wildfire. And so we can still use prescribed fire in these areas for potential benefits, but it won't necessarily be the same as wildfire. In this particular study, he listed things in like macroinvertebrates, tailed frogs, fish, riparian cover, organic debris, large wood, undercut banks, water temperatures. And in their prescribed fire, they saw no effects of any of those prescribed fire applications. In wildfire, they saw significant responses in each of those, either increasing or decreasing. So it's a very interesting thought. On one hand, the good news is here that the prescribed fire had no significant effect on any of these critical ecological functions. And so it does show that prescribed fire could be used and perhaps have little ecological damage if it's done well. But on the other hand, it wouldn't necessarily emulate wildfire and have the effects that might be associated with wildfire if that's what we're trying to introduce into our landscape. So to summarize, what are some of the potential positive effects of early cirral riparian forests? One of them is increased aquatic primary production. You remove the canopy or have a more open canopy, and you may get more light to a stream. Though I will point out that there's a cirral stage probably somewhere between 20 to 50 to 60 years that, depending upon the site and the size of the stream, can be very, very dark. You can actually have a dense, low, tight canopy over a young riparian forest, in a young riparian forest, if the stream is narrow. And that it actually opens up with the gap development in an older forest. But you do have the potential, at least in the early, very early cirral stages, of having more light reaching the stream and more primary production. As a result, you can have more nutrient uptake. And so in terms of water quality, you can remove nitrogen and phosphorus from the stream through that higher rates of primary production in the stream. You can have increased quality of allochthonous inputs. The quality of alder leaves, big leaf maple leaves, willow leaves, is substantially greater as a food resource for aquatic insects than Douglas fir needles or cedar. And so there's a potential increase in the quality of the food supply compared to the older forest. And algal material is even higher quality because algae doesn't have any of the structural components that wood does that tends to resist decay. The other possible benefit, if you have a really, really, really cold stream, is that the increased temperature can increase the growth rates and the rates of critical biological processes such as primary production and respiration. So if your stream temperatures are down below 15, below 10 degrees C, then you could actually increase biological rates. And some people in Alaska have noted this, that they see increased rates of growth because they have such cold streams, and by opening them up and warming them up, they get increased biological activity. You can obviously see the coming flip side of that. The potential negative effects are that increased temperature can decrease growth, increase disease, increase competition between fish species, and cause mortality. And we've seen this throughout the Northwest, that temperatures much over 17, 18 degrees have been associated with negative biological effects. We see you can get decreased uptake of nutrients by the riparian plants, depending upon the condition of the riparian forest. And you can get decreased inputs of large wood. The early cereal stages will not produce as much large wood, and it will decay faster, and it will not be as large and play the same structural role in the stream. So you get decreased habitat complexity, decreased refuge during floods, decreased channel stability, and decreased food and nutrient retention. When people have talked to me about the need to have open sites in early cereal stages in our landscape, I look around Oregon and say, we're not really short on that. There's an awful lot of that compared to the historical range of variation. And so we have an awful lot of open sites and open systems, and even along mature to old-growth forest reaches, floods batter and open gaps along the stream and create lots of openings in early cereal stages along streams. Streams are places where you found those species historically because of the disturbance rates. And so here from the study in the Coast Range, we see that the largest proportion of the length of streams were bordered by young forest. It's not like we're running short on this stuff. And so really, to answer this question of the benefits and the role of early cereal stages in riparian areas, the question is a landscape one. What proportion of the landscape and the river network is in early forest, cereal forests, and what proportion of the riparian areas are? And so what are the network patterns of environmental factors such as temperature, in which opening up those headwater streams causes increased warming to downstream reaches, nutrients and physical structure, and then what's the network pattern of the aquatic ecosystem, and how would our management of early cereal forest across the landscape influence those inherent patterns of the river network, not just the site that we're looking at. Thank you.